it felt like we had got past this concept of tyranny. Like the great democratic experience had won, and we were no longer needed to be afraid of tyranny, or it wasn't real anymore, which to me is hilarious because the story of humanity is tyranny, and there was this rejection against it, but like that thing's going to be slipping its way back. What do you think got us to the point where we thought the battle was over?
Yeah.
That like good had won. And then where do you see tyranny today in ways that might be non-obvious to general pop?
Freedom won, yeah. America, the Constitution. We can now take that for granted. It's done. Forget the repetitive patterns throughout history, which proves to us like good things will slip away if we allow them. So I think one thing that allowed it is people are afraid to be afraid, including myself. Like if you see someone who's actively expressing fear, that's actually a low level of fear. And it's awesome that they're expressing their honest emotion and they can do that. But fear is a very scary thing to experience. So a lot of people have an emotional charge about their emotions. So if you have fear, then a fear of that fear can come up. So essentially we're afraid to be afraid. And because we're afraid to be afraid, we look at scary things that history has proven like, these will basically happen. It's the underbelly of human nature. It's egotistical nature left unchecked. These things will happen if people lay down and take things for granted. But that is so scary. You read history like Stalin takes over and all these scary things. That is a lot of fear to process that could happen. So because we're afraid to be afraid, we go into denial that could ever happen. And so many people, including myself, like we look at, even if it happens in other countries present day, that could never happen here. Mm-hmm. So denial is a hell of a thing. I think that's denial of what could happen, denial of what has happened. Then we get narcissistic and say, not me. That could never happen here. So we take things for granted. I think a part of that, there's the old saying, hard times create strong people. Strong people create easy times. Easy times create weak people. Weak people create hard times. That's a cycle. As crappy as that is, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know how generationally we can possibly break that cycle unless people are so intentional and remember the lessons of history. So we've had some pretty easy times the past 2-3 decades. And I hate to say it, that's created a lot of weak people, mindset, also physically as well. And that's statistically pretty easy to prove. So people who have gotten weak because there haven't been many weights to lift in society. You know, World War II, the Great Depression, like our grandparents, like they lived through hard times. They were strong people. Those strong people created some easy times. Mm-hmm. Those easy times created some weak people. And it's not really an insult to the weak generation. It's just understanding they didn't have heavy weights to lift. Mm-hmm. Unless someone was like motivated, I'm going to go out and do hard things. But life was just kind of easy, and the muscle can only be as strong as the weight is heavy. So people got kind of weak. We're less vigilant. We're a little more obedient. Mm-hmm. We kind of forget what we really stand for because we haven't really needed to stand for it. And then I think we fall for some tyranny that I, first time in my life as an American, really started to recognize during COVID. And I love your other question, like some tyranny that might be there that's not necessarily obvious, that people might not recognize. To me, it's the inner tyrant. It's easy to point our fingers. Like, who don't you like that you consider a tyrant? Like, whatever, Gavin Newsom, Justin Trudeau, this world leader, that pharmaceutical company. I see a lot of tyranny there as well. But let's have a little self-responsibility and self-awareness. Just for example, near the beginning of COVID, my YouTube channel really started to face some censorship. Mm-hmm. You know, luckily, it didn't get deplatformed, but I'm having videos taken down and all kinds of censorship. And at first, it just pissed me off. Like, how this is violating the First Amendment. And yeah, I get these companies. They're companies. They can function independently, but they're really infringing on freedom of speech. Then we find out the federal government was instructing big tech companies on who and what to censor. That's 100% a First Amendment violation. So with the censorship, I was getting pissed off at the tyranny, like infringing on freedom of speech. That is the single most important freedom, I think. So I was pissed off at the external tyranny. But after a while, I started to remember one of the life principles that I've always held near and dear. I believe it to be true. It's easy to remember when it's easy to remember. But when I actually need that lesson, that's when it's hard to remember. And that lesson is the world is our mirror. It's certainly more than our mirror, but it's a mirror. How we feel about other people is ultimately how we feel about ourselves. We're just projecting ourselves onto the mirror around us is a beautiful way of discovering our undiscovered self, our shadow self. I think there's more that we don't know about ourselves compared to what we do know about ourselves. And we especially know we're looking in a mirror when we have a heightened emotional charge. But of course, that's when it's most tempting to just be the blind gopher. We're looking in the mirror and we get angry at the mirror instead of self-realizing who's looking in the mirror and what am I seeing about that who that is ultimately me. So a lot of wisdom says you can't get upset about someone who doesn't represent something about yourself that you're probably in denial of. So I said, okay, I need to check myself. There's a lesson I need to learn. I think I'm mad at the tyranny that I see on the outside, and I am. But if this is a story about me, what have I not been seeing for most of my life? And as I sat with that, I realized, oh yeah, I treat myself like a tyrant a lot of times. I don't treat other people like a tyrant, so it's easy to not see it. But how hard am I on myself? How demanding am I on myself? JP, you better be super productive today or else you're unworthy. That's very tyrannical. And I realize also nobody censors me more than I do. You know, I've lived a lot of my life as an approval addict. So I would censor myself. I would suppress my own speech that I feared might get me disapproval from people. So in that respect, I started to become grateful for the external tyranny that I was seeing because without it, I wouldn't have had the emotional charge at it. And therefore, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to ask the question, what am I seeing in them that is actually me? Expressed differently, but it's the same pattern of tyranny. So I think the biggest tyranny that goes unseen is how people treat themselves like a tyrant. And as long as we do that, we're the perfect vibrational match for external tyranny. Yet if we start to see our internal tyrant, what are the ways I do that to myself? Really robbing myself of my own freedom. I have to conform to this set of standards so that I can be worthy, is the story. As we can address it, realize it, and get uncomfortable disrupting that pattern by living in a new way, treating ourselves in a new way. Now we start to become more internally free. Then we become a perfect vibrational match for external freedom.